Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to look at Publishers Weekly's best books of 2024. If you know me, you know I love going through end of year best lists, long lists, all of that as tools of discovery. So quick PSA, because people get very upset if they think I'm trying to review books I haven't read. I am using this to help me find books that I might want to read. I am doing it in a video so I can help other people find books that they might want to read. These are not reviews. I can talk about the books that I have read. Anything else will just be about my interest level in them. There will also be affiliate links to all of these books if you want more information about them or want to purchase. If this video sparks an interest, you may do that through these links, or you can go to your local independent bookstore, or you can support your local library. That is always a good thing to do. Now, Publishers Weekly does a lot of different categories. They do the best fiction, the best mystery thriller, the best poetry, the best romance, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and so on and so forth. I am only going to look at their top 10 and their fiction choices in this video. I will have a link to the top 10 and the fiction list in the description box down below. You can use that link to navigate to the other categories. One problem is that top 10s tend to ignore genre. And this way you can find out some lists that specifically cater to those. So without further ado, let's dive in, starting with the top 10, the best overall books of 2024, according to Publishers Weekly. The first one is All Fours by Miranda July. And I smile and kind of laugh because this is turning out to be one of the cilantro books of the year. And when I say cilantro, I mean it is really seriously love it or hate it. And in fact, when it appeared on the New York Times Book Review's top 10 books of 2024, a video I did that I will link down below, it mostly got extremely negative feedback in the comments on that video. There was very little positive about it. And I think this is one of those things where even people who were sort of meh about it when they read it, now that they are seeing it show up on so many of these lists, they're starting to think, what's the big deal? And sometimes when that happens, your opinion on the book sours, even though you were a little okay with it. So it's really interesting to keep seeing All Fours pop up. I don't think anybody really predicted that All Fours was going to be such a presence on these lists. I will read the quick blurb that Publishers Weekly provided for this, but first I will say with my experience with Miranda July, I attempted to read one of her short story collections earlier this year and found it a little bit cloying. I thought it was trying too hard to be funny and hipsterish, and I DNF'd pretty quickly. So I feel very comfortable sitting out on All Fours and letting people who enjoy it have their little party, and I will be elsewhere hanging out and reading other books. So that's fine. Here's the blurb that Publishers Weekly offers. Funny, sexy, weird, but most of all deeply serious, July's novel is better than anything she's ever done, whether on the page, in film, or any of the other mediums she's worked in. With the story about aging, desire, and mortality, July dramatizes how for an artist, the only way to face questions about life and death is by making art, which is something that would interest me, if not for the Miranda July connection and the fact that I attempted one of her books and really did not get along with it very well. Next, we have The Book of Love by Kelly Link. Kelly Link is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and if you know me, you know I'm obsessed with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I haven't read any of her books. She usually writes stories, so this is her first novel, and it's big. It's a brick of a book. You could really hurt somebody with The Book of Love if you wanted to. I don't know why you would want to, but you could. And because it has sort of fantastical elements, I felt a little bit like, I think I'm going to sit this one out. It has been popping up on some end of year lists, and feedback I've gotten from a couple of people has been that they think I would actually like it because it's not really high fantasy and there are some literary connections and plot lines involved that are things that I would usually like. And I do think it is important to read outside your comfort zone. That's a refrain I keep going to. And the best way to do that is really to find a book in a certain category that meets you where you are. So if you don't read a lot of sci-fi or fantasy, find a book that flirts with those tropes that is in a wheelhouse that you enjoy. And it's starting to sound like, from feedback, The Book of Love might be that. I don't know that I'm going to prioritize it, but it did pique my interest that some people have said that. Here's what Publishers Weekly says. Short story writer Link tries her hand at a novel and magnificently pulls it off with this fantasy-fueled ghost story. I also don't really do ghost stories, so I think that's another mark against this book that I'm now kind of thoughtful face emoji reconsidering. It's about 3 dead teens who get a chance to come back to life, and as Link chronicles their interlocking lives, the narrative sheds fascinating light on the nature of love, which does sound interesting. And unlike All Fours, the feedback I've gotten from people who have read the Book of Love has been pretty universally positive. So that again makes me think maybe I should reconsider my earlier decision not to read it. But I definitely don't think it's something that I am going to prioritize, certainly not before the end of the year. There's not much time before the end of the year. Now we get to what I'm pretty sure is the first nonfiction book on the list, By the Fire We Carry, The Generations-Long Fight for Justice on Native Land by Rebecca Nagle. Nagle draws on archival sources to paint an astonishing picture of 19th century Native dispossession and its aftershocks, bringing together stories of Native Americans struggling against settler violence across time, from high-stakes treaty negotiations to modern-day courtroom dramas. This is a kaleidoscopic overview of the dense legal webs that have ensnared and nullified Indigenous rights for generations. That does sound really fascinating. Sounds like it would be a little bit upsetting, but in the year 2024, heading into 2025, hopefully we can all acknowledge that the history of the United States is not great when it comes to treatment of Black people, when it comes to treatment of Indigenous people. And I think I'm going to make a bit of an effort, I'm thinking, to read nonfiction in 2025, because I really have not read a lot this year. And I got some good ones off of the New York Times book reviews list, and this one seems like one that I could be really interested in reading. So if you have read it, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. I'm inclined to seek it out somewhere, probably on audio. Now we have The Heart That Fed, A Father, a Son, and the Long Shadow of War by Carl Sciacatano. I really hope I said that correctly. I'm trying to go into this list a little bit fresh, so I haven't really... I took a quick peek through to see if there were books that I own, and I didn't really look at... I should have researched the name better. I apologize. Comics artist accomplishes a rare feat in this superb graphic nonfiction narrative. As he documents his father's Vietnam War-era military service and PTSD, he employs comics' cinematic tricks to grab readers while also grounding the narrative in dialogue and historical detail. The result is a moving and meticulously constructed examination of the legacy of violence. I am sold. I hadn't heard of that book before this. This description was the first I'm hearing of it. It sounds fascinating. And I love graphic memoirs. I love graphic memoirs that look at, I love books in general that deal with family history and the sort of ripple effects of trauma over time. I love a book about a complicated family. Some of my favorite graphic memoirs are Fun Home and Mouse, Volume 1 and Volume 2, which deal with trying to reconcile trauma from or that your parent had. And this sounds like something I would really love. If you've read it, I'd love to hear what you thought of it. But I am inclined to check my library to see if they have a copy of that. Because again, supporting your local library is a good thing to do. Next, we have Hersht 07769. I am not going to attempt to pronounce the name again. I should have done a little bit of research. If you look at the book down below, you'll see the author's name, but it is translated from the Hungarian by Ottilie Mulzet. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The downside of trying to go in fresh is that, again, you don't have time to research translation, the way to pronounce names, and I always feel really guilty. So I've fallen into that trap twice already. We'll see how many more times it comes up. The form is demanding. It's a single 400-page sentence, but this latest work is worth every moment of concentration. At the center of the narrative is Florian Hersht, a gentle giant with an intellectual disability who's being exploited by a neo-Nazi gang leader. What makes this so exciting and satisfying is the author's clear-eyed and open-hearted exploration of conspiracy thinking and nationalism and the divisiveness they fuel. I had not heard of this book before. Description was the first that I'm experiencing of it. That actually really does sound fascinating. So All fours in my own personal disinterest in reading it aside, this has been a very solid list so far, and we are only halfway through. Now, when I skimmed through to see if there were any books I was familiar with, of course I saw James by Percival Everett. I had a feeling it was going to be there, so I had to grab my copy so I can hold mine up. This is, other than All Fours, probably the most consistently recognized, and in fact, I think it beats out All Fours as the most recognized book of 2024 so far. It was a finalist for the Booker Prize. It won the National Book Award. It was on the Washington Post's Best Books of 2024, which will be linked down below. It was on the New York Times Book Review's Top 10 of 2024, and its Publishers Weekly's Top 10 as well. So no surprise to see this here. Let's read their blurb. Everett has ascended to blockbuster status without leaving behind what makes him special. Here, he rewrites Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in a novel that's more kinetic and intellectually stimulating than the original. Language is a central subject as the literate and well-read Jim slyly coarsens his speech when talking to whites. So is revenge, which figures into the book's explosive and satisfying climax. The climax left me a little in a lurch when I read this book shortly after it was first published. And it was only as the book sat with me that I started to really appreciate what Percival Everett did and the direction that he went. And reflecting on the original ending of Huckleberry Finn, I don't think he could have done that without making it feel cheap. So without spoiling anything, I have come to really appreciate it. I think this is a very intelligent book, and I am glad to see it getting so rewarded. If you haven't read it, it's definitely an interesting book to talk about as well. So not surprised to see it here. I think we'll be seeing a lot more of it as we look at more year-end best lists. And it seems like the front runner for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but front runner status for that can ultimately mean nothing. So we'll have to wait and see. But definitely not surprised at all to see James on this list. Now we have My Friends by Hisham Matar. There's been a lot of really good feedback on this one. It was on the long list for the Booker Prize. A lot of people were very upset when it didn't make it onto the short list for the Booker Prize. And it was in contention for the National Book Award as well. It has been a little more inconsistent in popping up on year-end best lists compared to James, and even compared to All Fours. But it is not all that surprising to see it here. It's a book that I would like to read. I'm not going to prioritize it before the end of the year, but sometime in 2025, I would like to catch up to My Friends. Matar channels Roberto Bolaño's theme of literary obsession in this sublime novel of a Libyan exile in London, whose two friends returned to Libya in 2011 to take part in the overthrow of Gaddafi. As the narrator describes his quest to understand life through literature, the novel's sense of truthfulness and urgency restores the reader's belief in what fiction can do. It sounds fascinating, and I've gotten a lot of really good feedback on it as well. Some feedback has been a little bit negative, but most of it has been positive, and I look forward to catching up to it in 2025. Now it looks like we go back to nonfiction. Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. Written in coruscating prose, Gumbs' innovative account of Audre Lorde's life, focused loosely on how the natural world informed the feminist poet's thinking, toys with chronology and form as it unpacks the mentorships, romances, and traumas that shaped her. It's the rare literary biography that stands up next to its subject's achievements. Now, here's my shameful confession. I have not read Audre Lorde, and I feel like I would need to do that before I would read this book. And Audre Lorde is an author I would really like to read at some point. I just haven't done it yet. So my barrier for entry for Survival is a Promise is that I would like to go in having read at least one of Audre Lorde's books. So I have a step in the process that I would need to complete first. And, oh well, if you've read it, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because it does sound fascinating. And speaking of biographies of great artists, we have Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell by Ann Powers. Reaching beyond the public image of Joni Mitchell as either a misunderstood musical genius or a megawatt pop star, Powers takes a freewheeling and fascinating trip through her subject's influences and obsessions, capturing her shifting musical selves. Oh wow, I lost the ability to talk. and the gaps and inconsistencies between them. Interweaving meditations on feminism, gender, and success, Powers paints a dazzling portrait of an inimitable artist while challenging traditional notions of what a biography can be. It sounds fascinating. I do like Joni Mitchell. I think there are other books that I would prioritize ahead of this one, but I do love the work of Joni Mitchell. So if you've read this, let me know what you thought of it. I have a feeling I would backburner this. It's not that I'm disinterested, but I have a lot of things that I would like to get to first. The final book on the 10 best books is When the Clock Broke: Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. This has popped up on other lists. It was on the Washington Post's, and I think it was on the New York Times Notable. And my thing is that, okay, let me read the description before we get into my concern, although I do still find this book, I think it sounds fascinating. The politics of the right-wingers at the margins of the 1992 U.S. presidential election and the center of Ganz's brilliant and witty narrative will be eerily familiar to anyone who's been listening to Trump. In his startlingly accomplished first book, Ganz makes a revelatory case for the origins of today's authoritarian posturing and its appeal to voters. So, history is complicated, and my thing is, yes, I'm sure you can see a lot of roots of our current political moment in the 1992 presidential election. I don't think you can really boil things down so simply. But it's probably still a fascinating book, and there probably are a lot of things. And I did get a comment from someone who does say that John Gans does reflect on things that happened further back in the past and how they also contributed to this, which is good. It's good to know. There was a book about, I don't remember the title of it, I don't remember the author, but there was a book about the chief of staff role and how since the Nixon administration, it has been the most fundamental piece to having a successful presidency and what the choice ultimately says about the legacy of a president. And it sort of ignores cases where that didn't work. Like it's sort of a faulty premise, but it's a fascinating book regardless. So, and I'm not saying that When the Clock Broke would be a faulty premise, but I do think that the situation is much more complicated. I would feel more comfortable not having read the book, so I shouldn't really be speaking. But I feel like if you're going to point to a single person or moment that contributed to the majority of our current moment, you can't ignore Reagan and everything that he did. And I despise Reagan. But to me, it would make more sense to go back to that and a lot of the things that he did, not just as president, but in his ambition to become president. But you also can't ignore Nixon, can't ignore that a lot of people are still railing against things that FDR did to get us out of the Depression and as part of the New Deal. So history's complicated. You can't really point to one thing and say that's what caused everything we are experiencing now. But it does sound like a really fascinating book. I've gotten a lot of really good feedback on it. I am interested in reading it at some point. I think this is another one I would do in 2025, possibly. Let's move to the fiction list. Now, I decided to include fiction very last minute. In fact, almost immediately before I started filming this video. So I haven't actually seen what's on this list. There may even be books that I've read. There may be books that I haven't read. There may be books that I own and will not have my copy of to hold up. It's all going to be fine. Let's go on this journey together. The first book on the fiction list is The Anthropologists. And I am not going to attempt to say that name again. I apologize. This is what happens when you try to go in fresh for a video. At the beginning of Savas's lean and heavy-hitting novel, the narrator faces a moment of panic with her partner. They've decided to put down roots, having spent the past several years living far from their respective homelands. The story, framed as an apartment search, blossoms into an indelible meditation on the meaning of home. And this is one reason I really love looking at long lists and year-end best lists. I had not heard of this book at all. And it sounds fascinating to me. Sounds like something I would be very interested in reading. So when I'm done filming this, I will loop back and try to seek out more reviews of this book. Maybe I'll see if my library has a copy because, again, it's good to support your local library and kind of go from there. But that sounds intriguing to me. Next, we have The Coin by Yasmin Zaher. The year's best novel of A Woman on the Edge centers on a New York City high school English teacher in exile from Palestine, where her parents died years earlier in a car crash. As she subjects her body and her apartment to compulsive cleaning rituals, obsesses over the city's filth, and deviates wildly from her school's curriculum, the narrative builds to a wickedly funny joke about the currency of trauma stories. As I said, trauma stories always catch my interest. I feel like the cover of this one is familiar, but I didn't really know what it was about. It sounds like it could be interesting. I think I would gravitate toward the anthropologists before I would do this one, but I could easily be convinced to read The Coin. So if you have read it, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. And also, by the way, since this is sort of a two-way street, I can only talk about the books that I'm interested in reading. I would love to hear what you are interested in from this list in the comment section as well. So please feel free to let me know. Next, we have Fury by Cleo Mendoza, translated from the Spanish by Christina McSweeney, and I really hope I pronounced that correctly. Stunning in its beauty and brutality, Mexican poet Mendoza's saga follows two soldiers from opposing sides of a war who become lovers after meeting on a battlefield. The imagistic prose calls to mind the films of Alejandro Jodorowsky, while interludes of oral storytelling evoke the author's indigenous heritage. The result is an unforgettable new twist on Juan Rulfo's Pedro Paramo. That also sounds like it could be really fascinating, and it's another book that I had not heard of. So this is really meeting the purpose of doing these videos and going through these lists. Finding books that you were unfamiliar with before that might be interesting to you, because that sounds like something that would be right up my street, and I will be looking for more information about it when I am done filming. Here's one that I have seen the cover of and heard the title of, but I don't actually know what it's about. God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer by Joseph Earl Thomas. Thomas follows up his acclaimed memoir, Sink, with a brilliant stream of consciousness narrative about a paramedic working in the emergency room of a Philadelphia hospital. As the narrator, Joseph, receives a series of battered and bloodied patients, he takes in the city's violence, reflects on his time in the army, and reckons with the demands of his needy family, all while going broke. It's a tour de force. This really sounds like a fascinating list, and another banger on the fiction list. I'm going to have to look for more information about it, so I don't want to commit to whether or not I'm going to read it, but it sounds fascinating. I do wonder about the stream of consciousness narrative. That is something that can be done really well and can turn me off. So if you've read this book, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. I am intrigued. Here's a book I really want to catch up to. I have not read it yet. Great Expectations, but not the Charles Dickens Great Expectations. This is by Vincent Cunningham. In this blistering buildings Roman, a young man works on an Obama-like candidate's presidential campaign in New York City. Cunningham, now a writer for The New Yorker, worked for the real Obama back in 2008, so it's a treat to get these glimpses behind the curtain. But what thrills the most is seeing the way Cunningham so perfectly applies his chops as a critic to his descriptions of politics as performance. This is a book that came out, I want to say in March or April, and I have been kind of wanting to read ever since. And part of how I haven't is that my library didn't have a copy when it came out. I requested that they purchase a copy and they didn't. I should look to see if that has changed in the months since. And the audio of the book was not available on any of my subscription apps. So I'm going to use this as a reminder to myself to see if any of that has changed, because I really want to read this book. Now we have Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I read Conversations with Friends, and I really think that Sally Rooney is a skilled writer, but I didn't enjoy the book. So kind of like Miranda July, this is a situation where I feel like I am totally fine sitting it out and letting the fans enjoy it. Somebody did point out that this is sort of complicated family dynamics, which is up my street. So maybe I should try another Sally Rooney book. We shall see. Here's what they say about it. Marxist purveyor of literary smut, ? Overrated romance author, ? With success comes detractors, but no matter what labels people throw at Rooney, her work stands as some of the most arresting contemporary fiction. Her latest, a compulsive tale of two brothers saddled with grief over their father's recent death and struggling to make sense of their relationships with women, more than holds up to scrutiny. And then we have Lazarus Man by Richard Price. I have never read a Richard Price book, but I hear fantastic things about his work. Let's see what this one is. Price, one of the best writers ever to take on New York City, calls back to his masterpiece, Lush Life, once again taking inspiration from a deadly event and casting the story against a broad canvas of urban life. Every detail in this one about the victims of a tenement collapse in Harlem and those drawn to the disaster is written with laser-like precision. I should mention my dog Teddy. His fault is asleep on the chair behind where my phone is filming this. So if you hear snoring, you're not crazy, it's Teddy. This sounds fascinating, and it recently was released, so I haven't really looked to see if there's a copy, so I'm going to use this as a reminder to myself to see if I can get my hands on Lazarus Man, and I think it would be a fascinating book to read. Next, we have an author with a Montana connection, Maxim Loskutov, and Old King. As tensions mount between a local conservationist and a logger in 1970s Montana, Ted Kaczynski's new neighbor gets caught in the middle. Meanwhile, Ted, an eccentric hermit motivated by his hatred of modern life, carries on the terror campaign that will eventually see him brought to justice as the Unabomber. Loskutov's deeply considered novel of ideas has the pacing of a thriller, and its heartbreaking ending is impossible to shake. I read a story collection of Maxim Loskutov's and thought it was a little bit uneven, and the only thing I really remember about that story collection is that in the first one, someone falls in love with a bear. It was just bizarre and interesting enough that it stuck in my memory, but I've heard really good things about this. The owners of Montana Book Company are fans of Maxim Loskutov's work. They have met Maxim because he has done events for them, and I feel like this is one that I would definitely try. Now we have something that I have an advanced reader's copy of and am interested in reading. It's Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst. I read The Line of Beauty and was a bit frustrated by the book while I was reading it, but ultimately enjoyed it. And then I DNF'd The Sparsholt Affair, but this one sounds fascinating. Even though I've heard mixed things about it, it might be a bit of a cilantro book. Hollinghurst trains his famously exquisite and exacting prose onto the life of aging gay actor Dave Wynn. Half Burmese, half British, Dave was bullied at boarding school and typecast throughout his career, and now faces a new form of ugliness in Brexit-era xenophobia. Hollinghurst's achievement is in crafting Dave with a deep sense of dignity, showing how his hero has lived a good life despite adversity. Sounds fascinating. I am in. Now we have Pink Slime by Fernanda Trias, translated from the Spanish by Heather Cleary. Again, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I have seen this in stores, and I don't actually know what it's about, so let's find out. Many novelists have drawn from COVID-19's world-changing effects, but it's Uruguayan writer Trias who best captures the pandemic's strain on interpersonal relationships and the melancholia-inducing loss of a way of life. She does so with the story of a deadly epidemic spawned by toxic algae, combining sobering eco-fiction with nightmarish dystopian elements for an unforgettable speculative novel. I don't tend to get along with speculative fiction, so if you've read this, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. And more pandemic novels are coming out. It's still a little raw and real for me, so I feel like this is a book I would let other people enjoy and I would sit out, but let me know if you think I should change my mind in the comment section down below. Now we have a book I've heard fantastic things about, Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. This was something that a lot of people wanted to see on the Booker long list, and it was not. So it's a big book. I have not seen a copy of it at this point, and I believe it has been released in the United States at this point, clearly because Publishers Weekly has included it on their list. Sounds fascinating. At some point I would like to get to it, but I don't have immediate plans to get to it, and I don't have a copy to do so right now at this moment. Aboriginal Australian author Wright fires on all cylinders in her latest epic, which stands alongside Carpentaria as one of her masterworks. I've also heard really good things about Carpentaria, by the way. Among the many threads of this polyphonic saga of climate change and generational oppression is the story of Cosman Steele, who sets out to save Australia by gathering millions of feral donkeys for use as transport. I've heard so many good things about this book, and I would be very curious to get to it myself. Now we have Rejection by Tony Tulatimute. I had practiced that one when he was longlisted for the National Book Award, and it's been long enough that I'm sort of stumbling over it. Tony Tulatimute, I believe is how it's pronounced. I could be wrong, but I'm rusty at it. So this was on the long list for the National Book Award for Fiction, didn't make it onto the short list. I did get a copy from my library, but it came like right around the time the election happened in the United States, and I needed to retreat to comfort reading. So I returned it to the library, and I think I'm going to get back on the list at some point because I have heard really good things about this. But that's my story with this book. It was bad timing for that library hold. Satire is alive and well, as evidenced by Tula Timouthei's flamboyant collection. One protagonist takes it to an incel message board after failing to convince women he's a feminist. Another sabotages his first potentially serious relationship with a man out of fear he'll be rejected for his kink. A throbbing heart beats at the center of the hilarity and ribaldry, making this irresistible. I mean, that sounds fascinating. So now we have Sister Deborah by Scholastique Mukasanga. I know nothing about this book, so let's go on a journey together. Mukasanga, long known for her portrayals of the Rwandan genocide, took up the intersection of tribal myths and Christianity with her previous novel, Kibogo. She masters the theme with this story of a feminist and anti-racist Pentecostal cult in early 20th century Rwanda under Belgian rule. Her depictions of spiritual visions, injustice, and superstition are by turns beautiful, stirring, and wickedly funny. That sounds fascinating as well. So if you've read this book, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because it sounds like it could be really interesting. Now we have Small Rain by Garth Greenwell. I have an advanced reader's copy of this that FSG was kind enough to send to me. I haven't gotten around to reading it yet. I would like to catch up to it in 2025. The best autofiction has an argument to make. Greenwell's, an intimate medical narrative about a poet's sudden debilitating pain and invasive testing during a weeks-long hospital stay, doubles as a blistering treatise on the inadequacies and indignities of American healthcare. What makes it shine is Greenwell's elegant prose, in which he sustains one sinuous thought after another throughout the narrator's harrowing experiences. The thing that will be interesting is that part about the injustices of healthcare, given what the current administration is trying to, or who the current upcoming administration is trying to appoint into healthcare positions, I might just get stressed out or furious reading this book. But if you've read it, let me know what you thought of it. I hadn't thought about that angle until I read that description of the book. So maybe bad timing to read it for me because things like that trigger my anxiety, but I'm still very curious. All right, we have 6 books left. And the first among those is Someone Like Us by Dinah Mengistu. I have heard of this book. It does sound interesting, but I feel like I always put it very deep into the back burner. Let's see what they say. In Mengistu's wonderful novel, told in a hypnotic recursive structure, an Ethiopian-American journalist explores his identity and lineage. The action takes place over 3 days, but the narrator ranges freely over decades of memories, guided at times by what might be the ghost of his biological father. It's a fascinating and immersive blend of rumination and fabulism. And I think it's the ghost that probably makes me pause. So again, if you've read this book, let me know what you thought of it. Challenge my perception of it and convince me I should read it. Now we have The Spoiled Heart, a novel by Sunjiv Sahota. Sahota frames the perfectly layered working-class drama around an election. For factory employee Nayan, the union is his life, but he's opposed in his run for general secretary by a woman of Indian descent who works in retail, and their clash fuels meaty intersectional disquisitions. As Election Day looms, readers won't be able to put this down. Well, Election Day's in the past, and if it's trying to conjure up a replay of Election Day, I don't need that in my life. My anxiety level's already pretty bad. However, it does sound really fascinating, especially the intersectional disquisitions aspect. So if you've read this, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez, translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. Among the many spine-chilling and crafty conceits in Enriquez's collection is the ghost pandemic plaguing a Buenos Aires neighborhood in My Sad Dead, where innocent victims of violent crimes haunt the narrator. Enriquez's nimble style, handily rendered in English by McDowell, extends to incisive body horror and troubling generational trauma. It's intriguing and disquieting in equal measure. I have not read Mariana Enriquez, and although generational trauma does pique my interest, my ears perked up a little bit, I don't do well with body horror. So this is where I'm going to need some feedback, especially if you follow along with my channel and if you know me as a reader. Let me know what you thought of it, because I tried a horror book in October and it involved a lot of body horror, and I did not enjoy that at all. So I am feeling like Mariana Enriquez is not an author for me, but let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Third to last book, This Strange Eventful History by Claire Messud. This was longlisted for the Booker Prize. I can't remember if it was on the short list already. What is time? And if you remember from the conversations about the Booker, I have been on a roller coaster with her. But the first book of Claire Messud's I read was The Emperor's Children, and I aggressively hated it. But a couple of years later, I read a book called The Woman Upstairs, and I thought it's a flawed book, but it has a lot of interesting ideas. So a bit of a roller coaster with her. Here's what they say. If no unhappy families are alike, there's no end to the ways of portraying one on the page. Messud, drawing on her own family history, brilliantly succeeds in this multi-generational story of a Pied Noir clan's exodus from Algeria during the War of Independence. As they scatter around the globe, Messud pores over their resentments and secrets without a hint of sentimentality. And because of my rocky history with Claire Messud, and because there was a lot of negative feedback about this book when it was on the Booker list, I feel pretty comfortable leaving it alone. But if you'd like to change my mind, let me know in the comment section down below. And again, let me know which of these books you are interested in most, because that's kind of the whole point of this. Now we have Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. Speaking of the long list for the Booker Prize, this was also on that. Although I will say, I'm not someone who read the whole long list for the Booker Prize, and people who did seem to have, for the most part, read Wild Houses and been like, it's a fine book. Don't really know why it's here, but here it is on Publishers Weekly's Best Fiction Books of 2024. And by the way, I think they don't include books that make the top 10, which is why we're not seeing James or All Fours or any of those. Here's what they say. This razor-sharp Irish noir begins with a loner unwittingly playing host to drug-dealing kidnappers and their innocent bounty, the teen brother of an associate who owes them money. It expands to so much more, though, as Barrett deploys deep psychological realism to plumb for the truth of how each of his characters ended up where they did. I think I have a lot more reading priorities before I would get around to this. I'm not opposed to the idea of reading it, but there's just a lot in line on my TBR before I would even think about picking it up, being brutally honest. Okay, here is the last book on Publishers Weekly's Best Fiction of 2024. I haven't heard of it. Your Absence is Darkness by John Kalman Stephenson, translated from the Icelandic by Philip Rotten. Again, I really hope I pronounced that correctly. Stephenson's magnificent opus glows with the magic of the Aurora Borealis. It takes place in Iceland's West Fjords, where a man who's lost much of his long-term memory begins his search for answers in a church. From there, Stephenson unspools a vivid set of stories and people on the precipice of change, which cohere into an endlessly pleasurable narrative of self-discovery. That sounds fascinating. I'm going to look for more reviews of this one and see if it's something that I would like to add to my TBR for sure. And if you've read any of these, let me know what you thought of them in the comment section down below. Again, let me know which ones you are interested in and what you think was left off. I've been filming for long enough that I'm just going to let you discuss what's not here that you would have liked to see, and do all of that in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.